Notable Greek educational philosophers. Introduction. Any discussion of Greek education would not be complete without giving full details on the educational ideas of three outstanding teachers and intellectual leaders of that time. Indeed, they have had enormous influence on later Western thoughts. In this study session, we shall examine the educational thoughts of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the early life and the type of education which Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had, and highlight the contributions of each of them to modern education. Socrates. Socrates was born in Athens in 470 BC. His father's name was Sophronicus. His mother acted often as a midwife. Socrates' early years were much more like that of any Athenian youth. He received an education from elementary teachers chosen by his parents and moved on to become well versed in advanced mathematics and astronomy. He was a capable athlete and a distinguished member of the city's military. He was married, apparently later in life, to Xantippe and had 3 sons. When he was not serving his city in the military or in the assembly, he worked as a sculptor, cutting and shaping stone. In later life, driven by an inner voice which he could not disobey, he gave up his trade and devoted himself wholly to teaching the youth of Athens and attacking injustice whenever he found it. He was fond of asking questions from the lowly and the mighty, probing for answers at any place, be it the marketplace, gymnasiums, or even on the streets. In fact, he was humorous and ironical, passionately fond of argumentation, interested in problems of conduct rather than in theory. A crowd of youths usually followed him, mostly to see how the mighty were brought low or the wise confounded. Some, however, came to ask questions and learn at the feet of the master. The people later turned to be his pupils. In an age of insatiable inquiry, Socrates was among the most persistent seekers. He believed that the very existence of the city he loved more than life itself depended upon finding answers to the questions he raised. When his pupils went from him to question others, the leaders of Athens became convinced that the teachers had corrupted the pupils and was a menace to the society. Educational ideas of Socrates. While earlier Greek philosophers had been interested primarily in the world of natural phenomena and had sought to solve metaphysical problems, Socrates concentrated his genius on social problems. He thus wrestled with such problems as justice and injustice, courage and cowardice, beauty and ugliness, etc. His major concern was how to educate youth for good citizenship. To him, if the educational system of a people produces good citizens, they will have a good society. For him, education was a man's most important undertaking. Thus, he set for himself the major task of determining what constitutes a good education. For Socrates, the human mind was the gateway to truth, and that the training of this mind in the techniques of clear, accurate, and unprejudiced thinking the most important task of society. For Socrates, this had profound educational implications. To create a society in which all men seek to do good, we must train men to seek to think clearly. If one has been put in possession of the tools of accurate thinking, he will know the good and will do the good automatically. By teaching, Socrates held that we can make men good. He placed the teacher at the center of man's efforts to build a good society. The subjects he recommended for the youths included gymnastics for the development of the body and military skill, dancing, music, and poetry. He also recommended geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and psychology. Most important of his list of subjects was ethics. When one learns to think correctly and accurately about matters in this field, he will do what is right, act intelligently, do the good, and thereby be a good and just man. Socrates taught primarily by a method that has become quite famous, known as the Socratic method, a question-answer technique. A student will come to him with a question to be answered, to which Socrates will respond with a question directed to the student. As soon as the student began to answer that question, and thus that followed, he eventually discovered that he knew nothing. Socrates' major concern was to convince men not of sin, but of ignorance. His method of doing this was the famous dialectic, by which he tested the claims of those who thought they knew something, applying a series of questions to elicit a latent contradiction or expose a latent confusion. Socrates never claimed to know anything, saying that if he were in any way wiser than other men, it was because he knew his own ignorance, while they did not. The effect of his questioning stimulated thoughts, and Socrates was surrounded by a crowd of young followers, in brackets, often young members of the Athenian aristocracy, who were fascinated by his method and eager to emulate it. At the age of 70, Socrates was tried before the Athenian courts on charges of disbelieving in the gods of the city, of introducing new deities, and of corrupting the youth. He refused to adopt any of the devices by which he might have secured an acquittal. He was found guilty by a majority of votes and condemned to death. Socrates has shown that knowledge which men suppose themselves to possess is not really knowledge, but only opinion or belief. To him, there is no dogma or conviction which cannot be shaken by well-directed questioning, and the only thing that we know, in the strict sense of the word, is that we know nothing. Plato 428 to 348 BC, was born in Athens into an aristocratic Athenian family. His parents, Ariston and Periton, were both descended from distinguished families. When his father died, his mother married Perilems, a prominent figure in Pericles' government. It was in the home of his stepfather that Plato received most of his early education. As a boy, he received the usual education of the privileged class in the elements of literacy, reading, writing, and reckoning, traditions of Greece, as well as literature of Homer and Hesiod. The most important formative influence upon Plato's youth was Socrates, whom he referred to as his mature friend, for whom he had great respect. He also had an exceptional literary skill, which enabled him to write excitedly. The turning point in Plato's life was in 399 BC, when he was 28 years old. In that year, his master Socrates, who was about 70, was put on trial before the Athenian court on charges of disbelieving in the gods of the city, of introducing new deities, and of corrupting the youth, and was finally condemned to death. Plato was profoundly shocked by the death of Socrates, the person he knew to be the wisest and best of all the men whom he had ever known. As a result of this, Plato deflated from pursuing any political career in Athens and engaged himself in traveling. The educational ideas of Plato. Like his teacher Socrates, he wrestled with the problems of education and saw education as shaping the individual, an instrument that could be used to produce almost any kind of individual. Thus, he turned to a study of philosophy to justify the goals of education. Plato later took a decisive step and founded a school of philosophy, which was called the Academy, after the name of the locality in which it was situated. Plato's school was the parent of all the universities which have been founded since, though the organization of Plato's Academy must have been informal in the beginning. Some years after the foundation of the Academy, Plato received a summons to Syracuse. Plato was invited to impart philosophical instruction to the young king Dionysius II. He saw it as an opportunity to put in his ideas into practice by making a philosopher of one who was already a ruler. Plato went and failed. Dionysius was unwilling to submit to the arduous discipline which was necessary in order to produce what Plato meant by a philosopher. Plato returned to Athens. He was recalled again to Syracuse some years later, but his mission was again fruitless. He later returned to devote himself to philosophical study and writing, and to the direction of his academy. He died in 347 at the age of 80. Plato was perhaps the first person in the history of civilization to develop a systematic theory of education based upon a comprehensive philosophy, and this was done with the flair and competence of a genius. In the real sense, Plato established the ground rules from which all educational and philosophical thoughts has developed. His educational theory continues to exert an influence on us to this day. Aristotle 385 or 384 to 322 BC, was born at Stagira, a town in northern Greece. His father, Nicomachus, was a court physician to Amyntas II, the king of Macedonia. And so, Aristotle spent part of his early life in the Macedonian capital of Pella. When he was aged about 18, he traveled down to Athens to complete his education and studied at the academy, but it is uncertain whether Plato was present at that time. Aristotle was certainly strongly influenced by Plato's ideas, but as we shall see, he later came to reject quite a few of them. When Plato died in 347 BC, Aristotle left the academy and traveled first to Assos in Asia Minor and then to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, where he continued his studies, especially in biology and marine life. He achieved fame about the year 343 BC, when he was invited by Philip, king of Macedonia, to act as tutor to his 13-year-old son, Alexander, the future conqueror of the Persian Empire. Here was the opportunity to put into practice Plato's greatest ideal, that of the philosopher king, an ideal Aristotle, to a large extent, shared. But as it turned out, Aristotle's influence on Alexander in this direction did not seem to have been successful, because after his father's assassination in 336 BC, Aristotle had no more time for philosophical studies. Moreover, his later political policies seem to have little in common with Aristotle's own political ideals. Soon after Philip's death, Aristotle returned once more to Athens, where he established a school of his own, known as the Lyceum, where he taught for 12 years. The subjects of instruction covered a broader spectrum than those at Plato's academy, and as far as we know, included physics, biology, ethics, politics, and rhetoric. The Lyceum became known as the peripatetic school of philosophy, in brackets, from Greek peripatein, to walk about. Due to Aristotle's habit of teaching his students while they strolled together in the gardens attached to the school, Aristotle was unfortunately forced to leave Athens in 323 BC, in brackets, the year of Alexander's death. And though after his departure, the Lyceum continued to function, it did not seem to have retained its influence to the same extent that Plato's academy did. The reason for Aristotle's departure was the growing Athenian hostility towards Macedonia, which had led to a short-lived revolt against Macedonian rule after Alexander's death. Aristotle's obvious links with Alexander and Macedonia meant that his continued presence in Athens was not safe, and so he left to settle in Chalcis, the mother city of his native Stagira, where he died the following year in 322 BC. Educational ideas of Aristotle. Aristotle's work has exerted a tremendous influence on Western thoughts, although it was not until the 13th century that the main corpus of his writing was rediscovered in Western Europe. However, after the time, and especially since the 15th century, when the bulk of his writing became known, his work achieved great fame and was accepted as authoritative on a large number of intellectual questions. The basic philosophical difference between the two was that while Plato was an idealist, Aristotle was a realist. It was crucial to all Plato's philosophy that there existed two worlds of reality: the real or sensible world, and the ideal or intelligible world. For Aristotle, no such clear-cut division existed. For him, all our knowledge is of the real world, that is, the world we perceive through the senses, and the forms that Plato saw as separate entities in the ideal world, Aristotle saw as belonging to material objects. This means that every object is composed of both matter and form, and we have no need to posit another order of reality to explain the one we perceive directly in everyday experience. This fundamental philosophical difference is also reflected in what the two philosophers regarded as the basic method of reasoning, because Plato believed that all our knowledge is derived from the basic forms or ideas that are somehow present in us at birth. The main process of thought is one of deduction from general principles, that is, universals, to particular facts. This is, of course, the method of reasoning used in mathematics, the subject in which Plato placed so much stress. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that our knowledge is built up by extracting the form or essence of an object by experiencing particular instances. Thus, he favored the inductive method of reasoning, which starts with particular facts and works up to generalizations. Study session summary. In this study session, we have discussed the major contributions of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to educational ideas. The three were great educational philosophers in Greece in their times. Socrates taught by questioning. It was a method that comprised of 3 stages, namely definition, refutation, and synthesis. Plato, the greatest pupil of Socrates, was an idealist who believed in the existence of 2 realms of reality, the realm of ideas or forms and the realm of appearance. Aristotle was a student of Plato, but he was a realist, a practical man, and was variously referred to as the hard intellectualist, a master of many sciences, and the father of biology. For Aristotle, the only realm of reality is that of physical or material or the sensible world. End of study session 3. Thank you for listening.